She just accepted the arrangement and went on with life. Okay? So she took that choice rather than cutting and run or getting mad about it and making a scene. Now, the Roosevelts had 6 children, and just to make a point, they were all normal despite the fact they were distantly related. They were all normal. They had 5 boys and 1 girl. 5 boys and 1 girl. Now, kind of interesting on this, 6 children. The first child, which was Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., actually died in infancy, really early, died in 1909. So their first child, Franklin Delano Jr., died in infancy in 1909. But the rest of their children lived throughout the 1970s, 1980s, with the last child, James Roosevelt, dying in 1991. So all these kids, you know, led pretty long lives, lived fairly long. So they lost their first one, but the rest lived through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The last child, James, died in 1991. So, Franklin gets out of Columbia University Law School and becomes a lawyer. But what do you have to do before you can become a lawyer? You should do this with high school seniors. You have to pass a bar exam. So you go all the way through school. If you can't pass the cumulative exam, then you don't get to be a lawyer. It'd be like you going to 4 years of high school, and if you couldn't pass a cumulative exam over everything you ever learned in high school, you couldn't get your diploma. That's kind of what, well, I went to graduate school and got my master's. I had 2 choices. I could write a thesis, basically write a book, or I could take summative final examinations. And it was over the whole time I was in graduate school, questions. It was a pain, but that's what they do. And so he passes his bar exam easily, but he really doesn't want to be a lawyer, so what does he do? Enters politics. Okay? So he gets his law degree, and he passes the bar exam, but he doesn't have a lot of interest in the study of law after all that, so he decides to go into politics. And he doesn't mess around. He decides he's going to run for the United States Senate, man. Boom. He's not going to be a mayor, or he's not going to be a council person or in the legislature. He's going to go straight for the gusto, and he runs for the United States Senate in 1910. And he wins, and he's only 29 years old. That'll be one of the youngest, I don't know this for a fact, but I would bet he's got to be among the youngest senators we've ever had. So he's 29 years old. In 1910 he goes and runs straight for the Senate and wins. Now this is kind of interesting. When he was in the Senate in the election of 1912, when Woodrow Wilson ran against Theodore Roosevelt, guess who Franklin Roosevelt threw his support behind? Wilson, not his distant cousin, or excuse me, not his cousin. So there's got to be a reason. So ironically, what does Woodrow Wilson appoint Franklin Roosevelt to after he's elected because of his help?
If your family won't back you.
What did Theodore Roosevelt gain by supporting William McKinley? Which position? Had to do with the Philippines, maybe? Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That's what McKinley gave Theodore Roosevelt for the support. Ironically, Woodrow Wilson gave Franklin Roosevelt the same position, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, for supporting him in that election. I thought that was just kind of ironic. So both Franklin and Theodore served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, mainly because they had thrown their support behind the person that eventually won the presidency. Well, we know, I don't know if you know, really have to write this down. We know that Franklin Roosevelt ran for the vice presidency in 1920 with James M. Cox, but they were defeated by Warren Harding and company. And after his loss in 1920 for the vice presidency, he simply went to private life, went back to private life. Okay? So he was enjoying himself after that loss. And on August 9th of 1921, he was with his family at their summer home in Canada. On August 9th of 1921, Roosevelt was with his family at their summer home in Canada. He was out sailing. He fell into the water while he was sailing and became unusually chilled. Okay? So on August 9th of 1921, while he was at the family summer home in Canada, Franklin falls into the water while sailing and becomes unusually chilled, cold. He wakes up the next morning on August 10th, and he's very, very tired. He figures, you know, I'm going to try to refresh myself. I'm going to take a swim in the lake. It'll be kind of cool. It'll kind of wake me up and get me going, get me over this tiredness. But when he finished his swim, he went back to the house and felt even more tired. So on the 10th of August, he wakes up very tired. He thinks, I'll refresh myself. Jumps in, has a swim in the cool lake. Gets out and feels way more tired than he was when he woke up. The next morning, on August 11th, he notices when he gets out of bed that neither one of his legs are working properly. The next morning he gets out of bed on the 11th of August and he realizes that neither one of his legs are working properly. The next day, on August 12th, he wakes up and he's suffering from very severe pain and he can't stand up or even move his legs, and his arms and hands are partially paralyzed. So over this succession of days, he's just getting worse and worse and worse. And on August 12th, he wakes up, he's in severe pain, he can't stand up, he really can't move his legs, and his arms and hands are numbing, they're partially paralyzed. So he finally decides, holy smokes, I better go seek some medical attention, and he's diagnosed with polio at the age of 39. He's diagnosed with polio at the age of 39.
What is that?
It's a disease that affects your nervous system. It was pretty common, then the polio vaccine came out, and if you ever listen to Billy Joel's song, "We Didn't Start the Fire," one of the terms in that is vaccine, and that's what they're talking about. We'll get into that next year. Well, Roosevelt took treatment. He worked very hard in therapy. He did regain the use of his hands, arms, and shoulders, and his legs improved a little bit, but he basically would never walk again without the use of braces or crutches, so to speak. Leg braces or walking mechanisms. So he works very hard in therapy to try to improve his condition. He did regain the use of his hands, arms, and shoulders, but his legs never came back to normal, and he would never walk again without some sort of help or the use of leg braces. Now, this is prior to the election of 1932, and despite this physical setback, he does return to politics, and he's elected governor of New York in 1928, which set the stage for his nomination for the presidency. So despite his physical setbacks, he decides to get back into politics, and he's elected governor of New York in 1928. He was re-elected governor in 1930, and as you all know, he ran for the presidency in 1932. Again, he was elected President of the United States 4 times, 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944, the only man in American history that will ever be elected to 4 terms. Now, he didn't serve very much of his 4th term. He died suddenly into his 4th term, and the reins of the presidency got turned over to a fellow by the name of Harry S. Truman in the latter stages of World War I. And then Harry Truman eventually made the decision to drop the atomic bomb to end World War II to end. Okay, and that was that's a very courageous decision. We're getting off task here, but I think Harry S. Truman is one of the most underrated presidents in American history. He made the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to save 1 million American soldiers who they projected would have been killed if we would have invaded mainland Japan. So he sacrificed hundreds of thousands of civilians for 1 million American GIs. I'd like to make that decision. Not an easy decision. Okay, interesting enough, as far as Franklin Roosevelt goes, between the time he was elected and the time he was inaugurated, he decided to take a vacation to Florida. So between the time he was elected in November of 1932 to when he took office in March of 1933, he decides to take a vacation to Florida. And on February 15th of 1933, about a month before he was to be inaugurated, he was scheduled to give a speech in Miami, Florida, and he was going to give the speech from the back of his convertible automobile. Just kind of something to do while he's there, more or less. So on February 15th of 1933, Roosevelt decides to deliver a speech in Miami, Florida from the back of his automobile. As he's giving his speech, an unemployed bricklayer by the name of S.P. Zangara shouts, "Too many people are starving," and fires 6 shots from a revolver in the vicinity of Roosevelt. So on February 15th of 1933, as he's giving a speech from the back of his automobile in Miami, Florida, an unemployed bricklayer named Giuseppe Zangara shouts, "Too many people are starving," and fires 6 shots toward President-elect Roosevelt from a revolver. 5 people were hit with those 6 shots. 5 different people were hit with those 6 shots. Roosevelt, fortunately, was not among those. Fortunately? Yeah, fortunately was not, no, fortunately was not one of those. Roosevelt escaped injury, but the most tragic fatality of that assassination attempt is Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak was there with Roosevelt. Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak was there. And he was shot in the stomach by one of those 6 shots and later died because of the injury. So Roosevelt escapes injury, but Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak received what we call a mortal stomach wound in the attack, which means that he was hit in the stomach and died later. Now, the reason probably Roosevelt might not have been struck, this is kind of interesting, is there was a woman there by the name of Lillian Cross, and she saw Zangara pull his gun out, and she actually tried to grab him, but the best she could do was swat his arm as he was firing. Okay? So there was a lady in the crowd by the name of Lillian Cross, and she saw Zangara pull that gun out, and as he tried to fire it, she actually tried to grab him, but the best she could do was swat his arm as he was firing. Probably saved Roosevelt from getting hit. Now this is interesting. As soon as the shots were fired, several men attacked, and well, first they tackled, then attacked Zangara, and they might have beaten him to death, honestly, but Roosevelt stepped up and kind of called them off and said, "Let justice do its course." So several men tackled Zangara, began to beat him severely. Finally, Roosevelt stepped in and urged the crowd to leave justice to the authorities, and Zangara will survive this attack. Well, just like Ronald Reagan, who survived an assassination attempt but was hit, Roosevelt's composure during this assassination attempt really made him very popular. People saw him as a good leader. He's nice and calm while somebody tried to kill him. President Reagan, who was shot in an assassination attempt, his popularity really increased after surviving that assassination. His reputation for kind of a tough person. Well, Zingara was initially tried for attempted murder and was sentenced to 80 years in prison for that. But that's going to change. Why? The mayor dies. Okay, the mayor dies of peritonitis, which is infection of the abdomen. And after Mayor Cermak died of peritonitis, which is infection of the abdomen, Zingara was retried for murder and sentenced to death. So he was originally sentenced to attempted murder and given 80 years in prison. But after Mayor Cermak died, Zingara was retried and sentenced to death. And on March 5th of 1933, they put him in old Sparky, the electric chair, and did him in. Okay? So Zingara was put to death on March 5th of 1933 in the newly invented electric chair, which they called Old Sparky. We'll finish up with this. After being elected to a fourth term, Roosevelt traveled from Washington, D.C. to Warm Springs, Georgia, where he was going to take a restful vacation after the campaign. So after being elected to a fourth term as president, Roosevelt had traveled from Washington, D.C. to Warm Springs, Georgia for a vacation. That was in April of 1945. I'm going to take a little time off. And he's in Warm Springs, Georgia, and he's working at his desk while an artist is painting his portrait. And that's on April 12th of 1945. So on April 12th of 1945, Roosevelt's working at his desk at his vacation home in Warm Springs, Georgia. An artist is in the room as well, painting his portrait. And suddenly, according to the artist, Roosevelt simply whispered, "I have a terrible headache," and just fell over in the chair. So on April 12th of 1945, while working his desk with an artist there painting his portrait, all of a sudden, President Roosevelt whispers, "I have a terrible headache," and he simply just fell over in his chair. He dies a few hours later of a cerebral hemorrhage, eventually being buried back at Hyde Park, New York. He dies a few hours later of a cerebral hemorrhage and eventually was buried back in Hyde Park, New York. The reins of the presidency were turned over to Harry Truman. At the latter stages of World War II, Truman makes the decision to drop the atomic bomb, and the rest is history for next year. Any questions on that at all? Okay, tomorrow we'll talk about the 100 days, and then we'll tell you how Roosevelt and his New Deal tried to solve all these problems of unemployment, banking, etc., and how good of a job he does. He does an excellent job of it, maybe better than anyone in American history could have.